Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Creative Goo. I'm here with Stephanie, our guest this evening. And let me get to a screen where you can see, and I'll let her introduce herself. For those of you that don't know, Creative Goo is all about the creative aspects of tabletop RPGs and related hobbies. I talk a lot about sculpting personally, and we had Adam on a few weeks ago talking about world building, and we're going to talk about actual physical sculpting today. That's Stephanie's jam, and I have her website up so we can give her pictures. But first, Stephanie, can you just start talking about, what got you into this? What do you love about sculpting these dragons and other creatures?
Yeah, so it's kind of wild. I think that the first time that sculpting anything was ever on my radar was about, oh my gosh, 20 years ago now. I went into a game store in what was in my hometown of Las Vegas, Nevada, and I ran a game store there, but I always frequented other people's stores as well. And in one of the game stores, they had a fully 3D sculpted version of Settlers of Catan. It had all the pieces with the sheep and the forests, and it was amazing, right? And back then I was like super poor, so there was no way I was ever going to touch anything like that. But it kind of, I wanted it so bad. It was for a long time. I was just like, oh, I just wish I could like do something like that. So fast forward many moons later, about a year before COVID, I was just looking for something to do with my hands because video gaming. I played World of Warcraft for a couple of decades. I was a guild master of a pretty large guild, about 800 people. But I quit playing pretty like seriously in Warlords of Draenor, and I had nothing else to do, and no video games were really drawing my attention because I'm mostly bad at them. So I was just looking for crafts, and I saw a lady on Facebook who did make a dragon, and it was beautiful. And I was like, how do I do that? And like I am wont to do about a lot of things in my life, I looked up a bunch of information, and then I went onto Amazon and bought like a just basic kit of a whole bunch of stuff. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen? I spent $30 for however many hours I spent doing this, and maybe I'm really bad. But as it turned out, I fell in love with it. My main first things were like the dragons with the dice and my steampunk ones. But I have since got like really delved into the tabletop gaming stuff, like making the big dragon sculptures that hold dice, or thinking about our January Kickstarter for Make 100 this year, probably things like dice prisons and, dice towers and stuff. That's what I'm thinking about. So it's kind of all sort of turned back into tabletop stuff.
No, that's great. And I find that, targeting a community can help, right? So, especially if you're going to be selling your product, is making sure that you're capturing that audience in some way. I mean, I bought the dragon protecting a dice. I think I got it from you at Genghis Khan, and gave it to my wife as a gift. And, like I said, we're all gamer adjacent, and she's got
Yeah.
it on her shelf, and she really loved it. And the dice jails and things like that can be really good. I did a timeout chair for dice. I did a dice throne and a dice hammer. I had a friend who tried to actually punish his dice, real ones, with a real hammer, and of course
Wow.
his wife got upset and said, "Don't do that." And I said, "Oh, maybe I can do a hammer that's kind of flexible and doesn't hurt the dice." And so those are available as STL files. But I now see similar things from lots of creators, around the globe. The dunce cap, and all that stuff. So there's lots of great things you can do, and dice are always popular. Dice accessories are really cool. So I'm gonna jump. You could go to Twitch, but make sure you mute your video or
Okay.
your Twitch, because it'll create an echo, and you actually have an echo sometimes, like when you turn your head and come back. I don't know what the magic is, but I can't find it on my side. It's sometimes when you change your angle, and I don't know if it's because the speakers partially off or your headphones are partially off your ear and the microphone's catching something coming out of your speaker. I don't know.
Possibly.
But it's not stressful. Everybody's hearing you, but just wanted you to know that.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually open Twitch on my phone because my computer is being wonky and I don't want to mess up what we're doing.
Yeah, sometimes the technology works and sometimes it doesn't. So there's a lot of moving parts right now, but I'm going to jump to the screen where I'm showing your website.
Okay, awesome. I'm up here now.
All right. So this is diversedimensions.shop. Let me grab this website and I'll put it in chat for people. Right now it's just Geeky, so thanks for joining us, Geeky. I appreciate it. If you have any questions for Stephanie, just let me know. So this is the kind of stuff she's doing. And again, she's doing this by hand in the real world. And the first question I have as we look at, I'm going to just start picking things out of here, is what material are you using? What is the
polymer clay?
Polymer clay. And is there a brand you recommend, or is it just whatever's more affordable? Or
so I personally recommend a brand called Sculpting Primo. It's the least likely to break after you bake it that I've found, at least so far. I have tried out other brands. Sometimes they don't work out as well, and then I just kind of like mix a little bit of it with the brand that I like, and then that way none of it goes to waste afterwards. But yeah, Sculpting Primo I feel like is definitely the best way to go.
And do you use an armature? Is there something providing structure inside these, or is it all just Primo?
Everything but the really small ones have armatures, definitely. Like you have to have it, or it's just gonna get it kind of wilts in the oven. I guess is the best way to put it. So we use armatures, or for smaller things, we'll use like toothpick skeletons and stuff, things of that nature.
Yeah, and so for those of you that don't know what an armature is, it's exactly that. It's providing structure inside the clay. It's like a skeleton. And no matter what material you're using, whether you bake it or not, the clay will settle or the resin will settle, whatever you have, if you don't have some kind of structure. I've seen people crumble up aluminum foil and have that be the structure. Wire is commonly used. The only thing you have to be careful of is Primo and the similar products are baked clay. So after you finish, you have to bake it. And I made the mistake one time, because I don't think, is I used a plastic armature. And of course, bad things happen because plastic doesn't belong in an oven. So
as a matter of fact, the dice stuff is a little tricky sometimes. You have to get the temperature in the oven just right, because it has to be high enough to cure the clay all the way, but low enough not to melt the dice. And I've definitely melted a few dice before by making it just that little bit too high.
Can you bake it and then put the dice in it, or is some of the sculptures? It depends on the
design.
Gotcha.
So like all my ones that are like the one you're looking at right now, that's like the big dragon sculptures. The dice aren't on that when I bake it, because they're all able to be taken off and played with. So, but for some of them, the ones like say this one, for example, where the dice is kind of in the tail or in his hand, it's harder to get that kind of function if it's not like baked around it.
Yeah, to give a visual representative for some people, like you've got these on this one I'm showing, there's gears and things. That's integral to the sculpt and would need to be baked with it. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So you have to be careful that you're only using things like, for example, the keycaps for the keyboards that you see on there. I can only buy keycaps that are a very specific type of plastic, not just any normal keyboard keycap, because most of them will melt. But there is one type that they make that is a high enough melting point that I can use it with the clay.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so I had them on the screen a minute ago, and then I lost it. But Stephanie makes these keycaps you can put on your keyboard to dress up your keyboard a little bit, and you can always search on the site for it. Maybe I'll try that. See if I can
I think it's in the games and stuff section.
Okay, let's see.
But yeah, I those are my new things. The ones that I have up right now are just the Pride ones, and then also I have ones made for each of the D&D classes.
Yeah, here we go. I'll do the one with the D&D classes. So these are
It's
the
super fun.
keycaps. Yeah, so this is a really neat idea for someone to dress up their keyboard. And so this doesn't go over their existing keys. They basically pop off their existing key and replace it with one of
Yep,
these.
that's right. And those ones specifically are for mechanical gaming keyboards. I kind of write a whole little thing inside of the post that says, this is how to check if your keyboard will be able to fit it, because some keyboards are really tiny or they just don't have space. And because I have to use that particular type of plastic, I can't really get like the thinner keys that go on like MacBooks and stuff. But if you're a gamer, you're probably using one of these.
Yeah, basically the extended keyboard that has the 10 key on one side and they're the traditional keys. Yeah, that makes sense.
Most people put theirs on the escape key because it's usually like off by itself, so it never has any problems. So if you see people who have already done it, it's usually there.
Got it. That makes sense. Cool. Yeah, that's a cool new thing that I saw recently on your site that I hadn't seen before. Um, where do you get your inspirations?
So I'm a really creative person. I'm also quite a bit ADHD, and so I've done a lot of different creative projects in my time. But at this point, I'm pretty good at sitting down and brainstorming. Like, okay, I want something related to this. Like when I was doing my big sculptures for the dice dragons, I was like, okay, I have these galaxy dice. What can I do for a dragon that's going to look like this? It's going to have to be purple. And then I found like the tutorial to do that dead tree that's in there. So usually what I'll do is I'll get an idea of what I want in my head, and then I'll just type that out into Google, and I will spend an hour just going through pictures, just looking at people's stuff, just being like, what do I like here? And kind of incorporating it. I'm not very good at like copying what people do. Usually it ends up looking like really wonky when I try to like copy something else. But I'm pretty good at kind of meshing things that I see that I like together.
Well, that makes sense. And you want to do your own style. And so copying is not really what you're after anyway, right?
Yeah, it's just like it's a really good way to just get ideas. Just Google images. This one, for example, I had a whole elemental set, so I was like, okay, I need an air one, and I just type in like air polymer clay dragon, and then I just have fun putzing around, just looking at all the images. I saw someone using that like swirly way of doing it, and I was like, I'm gonna learn how to do that. That looks really cool.
Yeah, swirling the different colors of the clay together is how you got that
Yeah.
air look. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, there's things you can do with the polymer clay as a material that you couldn't do with paint, or that, well, you maybe could if you were an amazing painter, but
I'm not very great at painting, actually, which is pretty funny.
well, as
Jiki, yes, I do. I do make miniatures for my games and stuff.
very cool. So, about how long does it take for you to make one of these creations?
It really depends on the size. Like some of the smaller dragons might take me like 1 or 2 days. I'm sitting down and probably actually working the clay 4 or 5 hours a day. And it also just depends on the amount of detail. But like those big ones that are the dice structures, those ones can take me like a week or more to just get everything. It's just big, and you have to kind of make sure everything sits properly, and it's a huge project. So it can definitely take a lot of time, but it really gives me something to do with my hands. And I'm that kind of person. I always have to be doing 5 things all the time, or I'm not doing enough. So it kind of winds me down and gives me time to like think and go into more creative ideas while I'm just working with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, do you bake it all at once or do you bake it in stages? How does that work?
It depends on the sculpt. For like guys like this, like the little guys, I can bake them all at once usually, depending on the design. But some designs will require like a stable base before you can do that. So, for example, with the big dice display ones, I would bake the base part first by itself and have that solid so that I can then kind of work everything up from there. And depending on the design, sometimes you'll have to do something and then go back in and do something around it or change it and rebake it. And rebaking it doesn't hurt it at all. So a lot of times it can make it stronger. There's definitely nothing wrong with doing it that way. It really just depends on the design.
So Kiki asked if you take commissions.
I do. I have taken commissions before. I don't have it set up on my website to do, but mostly people just message me on Facebook if they want something specific. I made a turtle with a snail on its back that the snail's shell was a pineapple for one of my friends. I don't know, it's really weird, but it turned out really cool.
Nice. So I guess Kiki's looking for an Alphinius Goo Dice Tower head.
Oh man, I don't know about people's faces. I'm not. All of the stuff I make is animals. I not so good with faces. I can do like cute kawaii faces that are very simple, but I have not yet found the strength in me to sculpt like a D&D character. I wish I could, and maybe someday I'll be able to. I've been working with clay lately that is a little bit harder, so you sculpt it more in the way that you would think of sculpting things normally, not polymer clay style. So maybe I'll get good enough to do that one day.
Yeah, every material has its advantages and disadvantages, and we can talk about that more in a second. I've worked with dozens of them. But I want to go back to the question about making miniatures in your game. So do you make little characters, with big heads, like almost like chibi dudes, or you just make the creatures, or what do you do?
I can do that, although usually I just make the creatures or like, not nearly as good, but similar to like a Dwarven Forge S type thing where you're making like tiles with different stuff on it. But my stuff is always like kind of cartoony, I guess. It's like it very rarely has a like serious tone to it. So if you enjoy that sort of thing in your game, like that's great. But it's not necessarily like most people are usually looking for stuff that's like really looks real, like the place that you would be, and mine would be more like Candyland.
It's representational versus stylized, right? So the stylized is the word all the industry guys use. So yours definitely have a stylized look, and definitely on the cute side would be how you could self-describe it. But for some games that could be perfect. There's a lot of games of different sizes and styles where that might be a plus. I've seen people play with Legos when they're gaming. So
I just watched Dimension 20's Crown of Candy. Oh, I lost your sound. I can't hear you.
You paused for a second. Yeah, so I think we had an internet pause. So we're back. You mentioned Dimension 20 and their candy, so talk more about that.
I just watched the Crown of Candy series, and like they did that. They made a whole stylized Candyland essentially for their game, and it was amazing. And I was like, I could totally do something like that.
Absolutely. So you can make it themed, right? So, but yes, you're a dragon from Stephanie wouldn't really make a big bad Lord of the Rings monster, right? So
this is not Smog.
It's not Smog, yeah. Or Ember Shod from, the Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves, right? So where it's you could say that dragon was cartoony, but it was still realistic looking.
Yeah.
Okay. So Geeky has a suggestion where you just drop the dice in his head and the dice comes out of his mouth. And in fact, if it didn't look a lot
like him when it rolled bad.
That's right. And so he would go in the timeout versus the dice, right? And it might be an advantage for it to not look too much like Alphinius Goo, right? It's only the insiders know that's who it's supposed to be.
Like a hint to it, an homage, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, like the pipe he's got that looks like a frog, right? So it would just be something like that would be identifiable, and the fact that he's a wizard. And he has to have a hat, and then that would always Phineas would say it's not him. All right, so um, you mentioned that this clay isn't well suited to sculpting like a face or something like that because of the properties. So, what is it best for? What's this primo clay going to be best used to make?
So it's really good for like very smooth things. So if you're sculpting little tiny details into it, that can be a problem. Um, it's not terrible for that. You could definitely use it for that, but it's a little bit easier to use. Like Sculpting has a brand of clay that comes unpainted that is a little bit firmer, and it's easier to kind of sculpt details like eyes, nose, mouth around that.
Yeah, the other thing that happens for those of you that haven't worked with this material is the more you work it, the warmer you make it, the softer it gets, right? And so that's an advantage, especially if you're trying to swirl it together. But it's a disadvantage if you want it to hold detail.
Yeah,
And
it's very difficult. It doesn't sit right in there.
and so there are baking clays, like Stephanie mentioned. Sculpey has one. There's another brand. If people are interested, we can share some of this information separately or later. I had one that I purchased that was designed specifically for miniature sculptors. So it's designed to hold detail, and you have to still warm it up so that you can make it work. But it holds the detail really well, and then you bake it. And that's where I made the mistake if I had non-metal parts as part of my sculpture. And of course, they just got ruined in the oven because I also use epoxy. And I mentioned this in a previous session where you mix two parts, so red or blue and yellow, and that's why it's called green stuff, is because it makes a green clay-like substance. It's a resin. And then there's others that are gray. So you have dark gray and light gray. You mix them together to create a medium gray. And then you have a couple of hours of working time to create your sculpt. And it's a build-up process. And so you would do the basic parts of the body, let it cure, then you would add detail on top. And so it's a different medium to work with, but you can do almost anything with that material, which is why miniature sculptors used that in the old days, because you could also
I can imagine.
Yeah, and so it's similar process to what you do, but you have a working time. The advantage of the baking clay is it stays clay until you're ready, and that's why people, the people that are material scientists that also game, develop some of these other technologies, right? So the other clays that we use that were just as computers were getting good enough to do the digital sculpting, there was a lot of material science happening. And of course, the computer won. There are still several sculptors I know that sculpt physical. They get molded and produce metal miniatures or collectible resins.
Yeah.
But most of the professional sculptors I know do what I do. They've migrated to the computer.
I tried to learn how to do 3D printing like way back, I don't know, 5 years ago when it first came out, like the first 3D printers were coming out. My spatialness was not doing it.
Yeah, and the early software was more math than art, right? So you were manipulating objects in a different way. I talked about this when I was modeling the other day. And then modern software, they're trying to emulate the artistic experience. And so you can actually sculpt in clay with clay-like tools on the screen. You're using a stylus like this, your computer stylus.
Right.
But it reacts much like you would expect a physical product to react. And you can add or subtract depending on which tool you use. And so that's about the phase I joined, the digital revolution, right? Was when that swing had happened. ZBrush had already been out for almost 10 years. And so they had solved a lot of those problems. And then the other software kind of emulated that. And then there's still software that uses the box modeling and things like that because it's better for making ships and cars and
Right, right.
guns and stuff to use box modeling, where the clay modeling is better for organics and things like that.
Yeah. Gigi, I know you said something about making dice, so that's a thing that I've contemplated before, but I would just be so worried that they wouldn't be balanced properly because it's really hard to control, like, you know, maybe the density of the clay or the size, or if your oven is not like very specifically the right temperature. Some ovens have like cool spots and stuff like that. It could really mess with like how the dice rolls. So I haven't really experimented with that too much, just from the worry that they just wouldn't be balanced.
Well, you would have a market if you understood those warm spot and cool spots in your oven so that they
Yeah.
always rolled a 20, right? So, don't underestimate
Well, we're
dice that
balanced,
aren't.
all right.
So, and that's back to the material science part, right? So, every material is really good for some things, can be used for some things, and then it's not good for other
They
things.
have a new polymer clay that came out a couple of years back that is bendable after you bake it. And that's really cool. And it can make some neat things. But I hate it because it's so soft that it's so hard to get it to stay in any kind of shape that you wanted, that I'm just like, okay, I'm not doing this. But it has its place. Like you can literally make bendable statues out of it. So you can make an armature that can bend out of wire, and then the clay will bend with it. But it's just so difficult to work with because it is so soft. It just holds every little movement or fingerprint, and I can't do it.
So, have you tried sculpting with gloves on?
I have. I hated it.
So, for material like that, though, that could be an advantage, right? You just wear your nitrile gloves; they're flush the skin. There is no fingerprint, right? So it would catch the divots of your finger, but you could smooth it easier. I haven't played with that particular polymer clay, so I don't know.
It's called oh my gosh, what is it called? Oh my goodness, I can't. I bought like a whole pack of all the different colors to try too, and I can't remember what it's called now. But if you look it up, you'll find it easily. You can just say, you know, polymer clay bendable sculptures, and you'll find that brand. It started out on Kickstarter actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of these developments, the material, the chemist knows what to do, but manufacturing can be expensive. So, but I just wanted to quickly show. I don't know if it'll show well on this camera. So, this is a 3D print. Let's put it somewhere where you can get some contrast. And I did this for, it's one of the GUI Den characters, right?
I have some of the minis. I bought them when we first started our campaign.
Awesome. Well, then I just wanted to show this one is sculpted, and it's just a one of a kind because I've already painted it. This was sculpted using resin, right? So it was green stuff for gray stuff. There we go. And so
I fear using things like resin and epoxy in my house because of my son being like high functioning autistic and getting into everything, and he has seizures, and I worry that like chemical smells will be bad for him. So I just do the little stuff.
yeah, the nice thing about the two-part epoxy, I mean, there's a little bit of danger because it's an epoxy, it's plastic, and so
right.
Not the awesomest thing in the world to put in your body, but it doesn't smell all that strong, at least the ones I used, and you never have very much because you're making small things. Now you're making bigger things, so you'd have to use a product like Epoxy. It's APOXIE, Epoxy Sculpt, and they also make some bigger materials that you'd use. The advantage of those is it's multi-part, either by weight or by equal parts or whatever, and so you can make really cool stuff, and it cures as a chemical reaction instead of putting it in an oven, right? And that's one of its advantages. And the yeah, and there's some that you can use to make molds, and for press molds and things, they make materials that you could pour over something or brush over something.
Yeah, I can definitely add magnets sometimes before, but also you can just usually super glue something like that on after you're done baking it too, if you're worried about like the integrity of the magnet.
Yeah, heat can change a magnet's properties depending on what you would need the magnet for. I would put a steel ball bearing in the model and bake that because the magnet will stick to the steel and you don't have to worry about positive or negative or
Oh,
anything,
yeah, that
right?
makes sense too.
And
That's really
then
smart.
you could put the magnet in the other product. And then the other thing you can do is just have the space for the magnet and then add it later, because magnets do change properties with heat and
Yeah,
some other
yeah.
things. And you
So
magnet,
I usually slap them on at the end.
yeah.
Oh, as far as my largest sculpture, so this is gonna be weird. If you ever played or know someone who plays the Dark Souls video games, in I believe Dark Souls 3, I don't play them because I'm very bad at games, but I've watched them being played. There is a boss who is like this old witch guy with like a plague doctor mask and a crystal ball and like flowing robes and a big huge hat. And I made one of him that probably my most detailed. I actually made it out of the stuff that is detailed, the sculpting that you have to paint. You know, the stuff that I was talking about when I was trying to learn how to do people. He's probably like a foot and a half. He was really big. It was, you know, a lot of different cures, a lot of different armatures, a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, that's cool. So I've made some big stuff. Like I said, with that epoxy sculpt, I made statues for the, to stand in the middle of the town square and things. From a 3D printing, I just finished my Brontosaurus. So that's the biggest 3D printing thing I've done. That was mine. I've printed other people's products, but that's the biggest I've taken on for myself. Um, but I'm trying to think what the biggest was. I think I made a dwarven gate where there were these statues of dwarven rulers on each side of the gate. And yeah, they were about 12 inches tall. I think that's the biggest I've made because everything I've done is to be on the tabletop for gaming. I
Right,
haven't done
right,
a lot
right.
of, things to decorate. I decorate with my miniatures, to be frank. So, like over
Fair
here,
enough.
I'd have to pull the camera off, but I have a shelf where I grab some of my miniatures from. So I have, I don't know, a couple of dozen here in my office, in my studio, and then if I leave this room, I have a shelf, a curio cabinet with 5 or 6 shelves just jammed with miniatures, and then I have bins and shelves in 2 rooms upstairs. So I've got miniatures everywhere, and other things that I've made. But yeah, so size is a challenge if you have
It
to
really
put it
is.
on display.
And it's more of a challenge than people think, both big and small things. Like the bigger it is and the smaller it is. You know, people are usually like, well, if it's smaller, shouldn't it be shouldn't it like cost less because it's smaller and you use less materials? I'm like, yeah, but it takes you like 3 times as long to get that looking right when you're when you're dealing with really tiny stuff. You know, people
Yeah,
sometimes don't really get
they,
that.
it's not about the amount of material. Now, the size when it's big, you have to account for the amount of material, but it's
Yeah,
about
sure.
your time as an artist, right? And the people that ask for, they don't understand, and it's okay that they don't understand. They haven't made things, but it's your time and your
It really is.
expertise and the creativity you're adding that makes it valuable, not the fact that you've used 200 milligrams of clay. I mean,
Right. Yeah,
doesn't matter.
and I make really little ones, my college critters that you saw on the website there, and those on a weekly, sometimes twice a week basis. I go out into the city here in Colorado Springs and I leave them out at like a park or something. And people go on scavenger hunts. Like I have whole Facebook groups where I post about it, and then people will post a picture that they found it. And I do that too. I don't know. I guess I just feel like it's really cool to just bring like happiness to people in that way, I guess. So some people are like, well, you're just giving it away. And I'm like, well, it gets exposure for myself. And I just love, like, so I make little Pokemon and I'll leave them at Pokestops for the Pokemon Go game. And people are just like fighting each other to try to get there first after I post the picture of it, you know, and it's really cool.
So there's a lot to be said for that, right? So here's a Harryism. I share them frequently. if you're an artist, you're doing art for the art. I mean, you're creating these things for the joy of the creation. And
Exactly.
if it's selling it, it's to share that and to help feed the family, right? So,
Right.
but
Yeah.
you're choosing what you make. And commissions are usually much more rare, but it's about the art, and so giving away is very much a part of it. So I started my journey creating the characters of the players at my table, and
Oh, that
they
makes sense.
and then often I would also make the monsters because they didn't exist anywhere. They weren't available for sale. And so both of those things would happen. And then the group I gamed with the longest would challenge me. They would say, okay, I'm going to make a half ogre monk that's using a chain. Do you have that miniature? And I'm like, no, I don't have that miniature. And so I'd have to make
Right.
it, right? Um, and uh, and then later it would be the same kind of thing. Like how I started doing the Zayate miniatures for Gooey Cube is I made one of the monsters from the first box set, the Darkest Dream. I made a spider creature. It's called an arachnic revenant, and of course, it's an
Mhm.
undead spider. They don't exist. I mean, they're now available. Other people make undead spiders, but
Right.
I
Right.
sculpted one and I just sent it to Gooey Cube just to have, right? And
Well,
then
that's how I made my dragon for that they have at the Gooey Cube station right now, because I we've been down there a couple times, and the first time I made them a little gooey dragon, and his like dice he's holding onto it is being sucked up by a gooey cube because he rolled a one, and it's the cutest thing. And I gave that one to him, and then for Cameron birthday I made her one too, and I just go down there and like, here you guys go, like it's adorable. I love it so much. And they're so much fun to be around, even if it's just going to their office for 20 minutes.
yeah, the Gooey crew are great people, absolutely. And then they did kind of the first episode of the game show that's been at conventions ever since, but they did it online the first time. And there was
Mhm.
lots of giveaways. Well, I printed out a bunch of stuff and sent it to them to give away, just for because they're great people and I supported the
I
models.
love it.
And so I give a lot away. And um, there's been some nostalgia posts on Facebook recently about, oh, check out this miniature. It's Raul Partha. It was done 1979. And I'm like, yeah, I had that one. I've already given it away, right? So um, oftentimes it's those new gamers that are just super excited. They didn't have any miniatures. And I would make a little set and say, Merry Christmas, right? So it would have some skeletons, a couple of some orcs, one of each type of hero, and like, yeah, you can start with this. And I'm sure those are more valuable, but they're getting joy out of it was way more important to me. And
Yeah.
so that giving spirit, Stephanie, I think is super important. And um, even if that person doesn't come back and spend money at your site, it's still worth doing. I think that's really
Oh, it's still great because I've had whole families post pictures, like they found one and they're all posing in the park, and it's just like, one, it gets people outdoors, which is like difficult enough to do nowadays anyway. But I mean, we're in Colorado Springs. There's so much beautiful stuff. There's parks everywhere you look. Like, yeah, get people out there. And I love the bringing of the joy. I guess I hope I never lose that.
yeah, me too. And so, and I try and find little things like I must have printed 1,000 green gooey cubes. They give them away at conventions all the
Oh no,
time.
I have one of those.
And
Yeah,
so,
those are
but
the ones.
it's the same kind of thing. It's like I used to put them in the bags because we would sell the physical miniature. I would add it to the product and then send it out. And people are like, what's this green goo? Well, it's a gooey cube. Who did you just buy from, right? And and then we would give them like we at Gen Con, I think we even gave them away. Every chair had a little package and there was a gooey cube. And because I printed so many of them. And then the first Genghis Khan I ever attended, I printed and painted Myron the Ugly Troll, and I gave those away. So everybody that attended the dinner got a Myron painted, and I'm sure some of them ended up in the trash, or left at the
Yeah.
restaurant. Not everybody liked it, but that's not what you give gifts for. You give gifts because you're giving, and what they do with it's up to them. And if they didn't know what to do with it, it's okay with me. I had no heartburn. And a lot of people were super excited. They were like, "Wow, this is great!" And that's, you want to have that giving spirit, and I think that's part of the creative community. It's not I can't say everybody's the same, but in general, it's not competitive. It's
I
let
noticed
me
that a lot. I love it.
let me help you be better, and let me give you some tips, or let me send some work your way. I know people that would love your dragons. I mean, and I've shared your website with several people, and don't know if it's generated any business yet, but that's how you make things work. But
Hey, you got to
um,
start somewhere, you know?
when I was first learning to sculpt in green stuff, it's small. You're making your own tools. You're doing all these things, and so the community was super helpful. At first, or a generation back, let's say like in the late '70s, early '80s, not so collegiate. Green stuff was like this top secret material that they used to create the miniatures, because it could handle the pressure of a vulcanized rubber mold with and
Right.
keep the detail. And so people are like, what the hell is green stuff? Well, it was plumber's putty. It's plumber's epoxy, right? And somebody figured out that they could sculpt with it, and then a few people found out, and but it was this mystery material. What's green stuff? And then once it came out, suddenly there's hundreds of sculptors, because it was like this miracle material. One of the properties it has that the clay does not is it stretches like skin. So let's say I sculpt a face and I pull on one side, it pulls like your skin does on the face. And
Oh,
you
that's
could take
wild.
advantage of that property. And cloaks you could make flow because it would pull.
Oh
You're
man, cloaks
not
are hard.
because you're not carving in, it's actually pulling the material. It's about halfway through its life of curing. You can take advantage of those properties, and that's why the miniature sculptors loved it so much, is because it made it easier to do those things. And the people that then moved to the customized baking clay wanted to sculpt, right? They wanted to be able to carve
Yeah.
into the face and make a shape, and not pull on it to make a shape. And so it was different artists using different materials. But understanding the material, making tools that take advantage of the materials. But the sharing didn't come for at least a generation of sculptors. It was a wild and crazy time back in those early
I
days.
bet. Oh man.
So, speaking of
It really
tools, what tools do
Yeah.
you use on your projects?
So I have like a set of, like the ball tools that you can use to make different like divots that are like circles. I use, of course, X-Acto knives are my best friend. I also have there's a few sticks you can get them like it's really easy to get on like Amazon. You can get like a clay tool kit that's like $15 that has a whole bunch of stuff in it. And I know there's definitely an advantage to having better tools. Like for example, I started out hand conditioning all my clay, and then my wrists hated me, so I moved to a pasta machine, and then I bought that pasta machine a motor, and now I barely have to worry about that part at all, and it saves me a ton of time. But you don't actually need a lot of tools to do good sculpting. Like you just have to okay. This is gonna sound weird. I was raised in a redneck family in a small town where you learn to just make do with things. WD-40 and a crescent wrench. That's like so. While I have tools now, when I first started, I only had a couple of things, and I just kind of used things I had around the house. I created a way to make dragon scales when I was experimenting with being more detailed, where I just took some clay, I took some aluminum foil, made it into like a U shape, baked it inside the clay, and then I could just press the aluminum foil onto other clay as a tool. Like you can get creative with the tools just as much as with what you're actually sculpting. But like that's about it. The clay itself, I use tiles to put them on, like from Home Depot. I just go to the ceramic section and buy like 2 kitchen tiles for like $1.50 each. They bake, so you can just literally bake it on the tile and then transfer it to the oven without having to deal with any of the other stuff.
That's a cool suggestion for people that want to try it. So, a tip on Zacto blades for those of you watching. So, a fresh blade you use for what its purpose, cutting and carving with a knife, right? And then it starts to. So this is what I would use for plastic models or dealing with scoring lines on a model, things like that. If you're cutting paper, you want a very, very sharp blade, but it dulls really fast. Well, then after it's dulled, you can use it for less important things like you're trying to chip off part of a paint or the end of a model. Once then, this is to the sculpting thing, then I file it down, right? So that there's almost no edge at all. Now it's a perfect sculpting tool. It's not going to cut my finger, right? It's not, but it comes to a point. It's got an edge that's very fine, but it's not dangerous as a knife if I slip, right?
Yeah.
And so make sure you know how sharp your knife is and what stage it is. But you can take a Zacto blade and make it dull and use it as a sculpting tool. So
I have used the weirdest things as sculpting tools. Like I've just been like, I need something that's shaped like this, and I just run through the house looking for it.
Yeah, it's just like most creativity. It's if you know what, if you see a shape and you know how it might impact the clay, or you can experiment with it, go whatever you want. Like one of the hardest things to do when you were, well, it's still hard to do digitally. Don't get me wrong. Chainmail is the enemy, right? Mm-hmm. It is very difficult. And so sculpting chainmail physically, people invented all kinds of different tools. The easiest is to take a paintbrush has that metal piece and then the bristles come out. Well, if you have a dead brush, you pull all the bristles out. And now you have this circle with a hole in it. Well, through that hole, you put a pin. And then you make part of that circle a half circle, and then you just rotate back and forth, and you're making the illusion of chainmail, right? Yep. And it was one of those things that somebody figured out, trying different ways, and then shared it with one sculptor, and then suddenly the rest of us all knew because people, you should tell two friends, they tell two friends, and so on and so on, and suddenly a lot of us made our own little chainmail tool. Now, digitally, there's a whole bunch of ways to make chainmail that looks really cool on screen, and it's not printable. And so,
I can imagine.
I might show that one day and some of the things I've done to compensate, because you're talking about something that's an inch tall again. And so if it looks like chainmail, it is chainmail. And so you're just looking for a way to make it look like chainmail. You can physically create real chainmail digitally, but it doesn't print because it's not it's not flush to the skin. There's all kinds of technical issues. So chainmail is my enemy. Anytime somebody wants a miniature with chainmail, I almost shed a tear because
like no, not again.
So plate mail's better, or leather, almost anything's better, But so yeah, tools. And I love the idea, just be creative. You can use in fact, there are some professional sculptors that use toothpicks. That's all they use.
Oh, I use toothpicks on my stuff all the time. Toothpicks, like you said, aluminum foil. Like if you look at the purple dragon with the dead tree, that dead tree has a full wire armature because it's so thin, but the dragon's armature is actually mostly aluminum foil.
Yep.
And it works just fine.
It works really well. And the other thing you can use aluminum foil is texture on the outside. So you can crumble up aluminum foil and press it against the bottom or the body, and now you have a textured model, right? A textured.
I have honestly found more success getting textured things from places like that than I have from some places you can buy tools that you can buy like the rubber things that are textures that you can use, but like they never work as well for me as just the random stuff that I make up.
No, that makes sense. I own some stamps, I guess you'd call them, for fur, for all these different textures. And I used them occasionally. They were neat. But for the most part, I would use other things. So if you're going to, and the Primo clay and Fimo, which is a European product, but it's a
I
similar.
like Themo too.
It's a
It's just harder to
similar.
find.
It's harder to find here in the U.S. Yeah, so it
Yeah.
depends on where you are. But Primo or Fimo give you a similar experience. It's great to work with. You can bake it in the oven. If you have a separate oven that you can use, that's sometimes people worry about the fumes, but they're safe. It's non-toxic.
Yeah, they are safe. I have a separate oven, but that's because our big oven broke. So.
And I did it because my wife bakes and cooks, and so whenever I wanted it, it was usually already in use, and so
Oh, that makes sense.
I had
Yeah.
a separate oven for it. But you can do it's a great project for holidays. It's a great project for things like that, and you can start with simple things and simple shapes. It does. You don't
Mm-hmm.
have to make you know. Um, a Da Vinci sculpture your first time out, right? Make something simple. Make a dachshund or make a duck. It really doesn't
It's
matter.
really like it's about learning what you can and can't do with the shapes. It's really about breaking it all down into the shapes and like learning how you can make certain things look like other things based on the shape. So it's kind of like a puzzle, I guess, to put together sometimes in your head.
Absolutely. I think of sculpting the same way. It's like what shape is going to get me that look, right? And if you're doing animals and creatures and things like that, it's all about shapes, right? So there's some
Mm-hmm.
texturing at the end, but up until that point, it's all about the shapes. Where a character model with clothes or armor or things like that or gear, that's a different experience. But
It is definitely.
and I enjoy, and I've told Alphinius this on numerous occasions. I enjoy making the creatures way more than I enjoy making characters. I feel like I'm a designer, making someone's outfit if I'm sculpting a miniature because it's about the outfit. Their face, while I
Yeah,
can
yeah.
do a pretty good likeness sometimes, it's going to end up
It's just
being
gonna be a face, like
4 centimeters tall, right? Or 4 millimeters tall. It's
yeah,
really, really tiny. And so being able to recognize the person's not likely at that small of a scale. So it's all about their outfit and their pose. And so that's not as interesting to me because I'm not, it's not as much creativity. Now, if they have something really cool, like they have a motif on their shield or they have, something else that's like a cloak that's just blowing in the wind and curling up. I've done some fun stuff with that. But after I've done it 2 or 3 times, like, okay, I want something else. And so
yeah.
that's why every fourth or fifth character I do some kind of monster or creature because I just want to be totally creative and do
Yeah,
something
I think there's some kind of I don't know, there's a feeling too, I think, about when you create a creature, a lot of times they're just more unique than a character, because how many hunters can you make? Or how many warriors can you make? They're all gonna have like an axe or whatever. Like after a bit, it's just
Mhm.
like the same thing. But with creatures, you have a lot of more freedom to like use your own vision of it and make it completely different. And it just feels better, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are 24 characters available in the box set of Darkest Dream from GUI Cube, and they're pre-generated PCs.
Hmm.
And I sculpted a few of them because they were very different. I hadn't seen anything like it before, so they were a lot of fun to sculpt. Then it was, hey Harry, can you make this other one? Can you make this other one? And I remember someone reached out, and it was the Sarth Ranger or half Sarth Ranger, I think it was. And I said, you do realize that there are 4 miniatures from 4 different manufacturers that look almost exactly like this character. All you have to do is paint the skin a different color.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
person was like, really? I'm like, yes, really. Just do a search. And so I gave them the links. They picked one, bought it, and had it painted to look like that character. And so, yes, the characters in Zayate are unique as far
they
as it
are. Yeah,
goes, but still, with a good paint job, you could make it look like almost anything anyway. And
yeah,
so, there are some characters I really personally don't have a lot of interest in creating because you could buy a miniature to represent that character, or Eldritch Foundry or Hero Forge. You can
yeah.
customize a miniature to be anything. and it makes my work. It's like I went to Hero Forge and created a model. I'm like, here, I did this in 10 minutes, and you can take a screenshot, you can buy the STL file, or you can have them print one for you and just go to town. Because it was faster to do that than to make it myself, because
Yeah,
it
it
was
takes so much time.
and there was nothing unique about it, right? So it's like, okay, I wanted to have a warhammer. Okay, here's your warhammer. I want a
Oh, yeah,
shield.
okay.
I want a cloak. I mean, and then you can pose them in those software packages too. So pretty much anything you want, you can make. Now, if you run into a limitation, now that's where someone like Harry comes in, right?
Right,
And
right.
so, but as time passes, those tools get more and more assets, and it's more and more likely you can create the character you want. And so I'm more and
Yeah.
more doing my art for me, making characters I want to make. Like I made a Brontosaurus, and I painted it in a unique color because who knows what color they were, because nobody's
because you
seen one.
can.
And so I'll showcase that in a future episode. And speaking of future episodes, we're about ready to wrap up today. And next week, Thursday, is Thanksgiving. So we will not be having
right.
Creative Goo, but we will be having a session the following week. And I have another guest. I'll be sharing that information on Facebook, on Discord, to let everybody know. But it's every Thursday night, barring holidays. And I really had a wonderful conversation today, Stephanie. I think it was very dynamic, and I loved showcasing your cool miniatures and dragons and all those great things. And hearing from a different kind of artist, I think was really cool. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, I loved it. I loved just talking, and it doesn't really matter if people are listening. And thank you, Hoodie, for showing up. I will definitely pop into the chat for the next one and see who you've got.
Sounds great. And with that, we will sign off. And everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.